Good morning and welcome to our how-to series. We're going to give it a couple of minutes to allow people to log on and to join us. It usually helps if we wait for a couple of minutes. So whilst we're waiting, please look at your chat box and familiarize yourself so that we can get started and you can engage fully. It's great, we're still seeing people joining us. That's wonderful. Just going to give it another 30 seconds or so. Right. Welcome and hello to everyone. This is our next installment of a how-to webinar series. For the last few weeks, we've been covering a range of great topics on online selling. A full list of these up-and-coming webinars that we've been producing is on our website, and they'll be made available at the end of the session. So let me introduce myself. My name is Monica Bird. I'm the head of marketplaces here at GS1 UK. And today I'm being joined by our fantastic guest speaker, the Managing Director of Marketplaces Growth Consultancy, Rich Insight, Richard Hurtley. Rich, I think you like being called Rich. So I'm going to stick to Rich.
Yeah, go for it.
Great. And so just a quick overview of what we're going to be doing today. The session is designed to provide practical advice and tips to help you sustain and grow your business, particularly now, as you start to think about other channels. And to do this, Rich is going to share some great insight and advice. We're going to look at what makes a marketplace right for you and defining your criteria. Am I going to make money and assessing profitability? What are my operational options and defining your operating model? And then how to prioritize, a scorecarding for objective results. So before I begin, I need to do a bit of housekeeping. So for the first 30 minutes, Rich is going to take us through his presentation. And then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. But we'd love your interaction. So during the session, if you have any questions, please use the chat function. And we'll share those questions with Rich. Also be aware that we are muting everyone. Your microphones will be muted just to avoid background noise, which you're probably getting a little bit from me, but that should soon end. And this session is being recorded, so it will be available on our website in the next few days. So without further ado, I know that Rich has got some slides to introduce himself, and I'll hand over to you, Rich, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks, GS1. Hello, everybody. I will just see if my clicker is working, which is always a good start. So yeah, we're going to be talking today about how to select the right marketplaces. So obviously we know that Amazon is a major marketplace in the sector, but there are many others, and there's various criteria, I think, that is good to understand when selecting the right marketplace for you as a business. So in terms of what I'm going to be covering off today, I'll do a little bit of an introduction to me personally, just to give you some context on what I have experience in, but also about our company, Rich Insight, which I'll whiz over. Then we'll be focusing on how to set the right criteria for your marketplace selection, how to assess profitability from a marketplace perspective, and the sort of things to consider from a direct cost point of view. Looking into choosing the right operating model, so reviewing the different options available and understanding the sorts of things to consider and perhaps the overheads attached to that. And then the final piece is around prioritization. So how do you kind of score up and weigh up the options and then ultimately pull a plan together? So it's quite a lot to cover in the half an hour allocated. So I will whiz through as best I can, but we do have obviously Q&A at the end. I'm looking at the chat box next to me as well. So if you've got anything as we go, feel free to sort of post thoughts or kind of clarifying questions, etc. So, I mean, first of all, before I whiz on to introductions, I'm assuming here that we all understand what we're talking about when we're talking about online marketplace, and I'm assuming as well that people here are kind of interested in global expansion, because that's kind of, I guess, a prerequisite to some of this. But if you've got any further clarification you want, feel free to kind of ask questions at the end, or kind of I can do any follow-ups after this call. So starting off with introduction. So in terms of me personally, so I started off, I've always been in retail. I set up a brand off the back of a history and politics degree at Exeter University. So not necessarily two things that you necessarily think go hand in hand, but we started off a business that started off doing socks and then moved into a full fashion collection. And we got investment from Jules about 3 years later, who is obviously a big lifestyle brand here in the UK and do quite a lot outside of the UK now as well. We also subsequently got investment from a company called Batra Group, who run the EMEA license for Russell Athletic and the UK license for Fila. So had quite a good inception into sports products as well in that era. And then I exited the brand in 2014 and co-founded Rich Insight with a few colleagues. I think one or two might be listening in with eager ears to this as well. And that was in 2014. And then in 2018, we became an eBay partner, and as well as doing more stuff on the Amazon ad side with Amazon. And today we're at the GS1 event, which is obviously the main highlight of my career thus far. So that's really just a summary. So I've got experience in fashion, in sports, in apparel, but we also did a lot of licensing. And we had a multi-channel business that worked across channels, so wholesale, we had a shows business, we had a retail store business, and we also had a marketplace business. And obviously e-commerce as well. So that's kind of my background and I guess the perspective I'm coming from. In terms of us as a business, as Rich Insight, what we do is we're fundamentally a marketplace growth partner. So we're here to help brands set up and grow their marketplace channel. And the key thing is looking at global opportunities as well as just domestic ones. So that's our kind of role. We have three kind of main elements that we focus on. So one is the planning phase, which I do a lot of work on. I sort of run the consultancy as well as the sales side of Rich Insight. So I will be using that hat, I guess, to support with the methodology and the thoughts on this presentation. We also help with management, whether that's launch management, ongoing optimization and listing management. We do a fair bit, and we have a very good I think track record in that area. And then we also do a lot around marketing and brand enhancement as well, and helping you sell more and represent yourself more effectively and defend your brand on marketplaces. So that's really I guess us as a business and what we do. In terms of some of the clients we work with, I won't go into all of them, but there are a real array of categories, I think is the point. So we have some fashion, we have some homeware, we have some adult products, we have some cosmetics and health and beauty, and everything in between, really. So we cover quite a broad array, and obviously we work with much smaller brands as well. So that's us, that's Rich Insight. The one thing I'll kind of mention, I guess, which is relevant to this is I lead a lot of consultancy projects, predominantly with bigger brands, around launch projects. So how to, what marketplaces to go after and what the right approach is for success. So I guess I'm looking through the lens of the process I use for that in informing this presentation. So there's a lot of sort of things that we've learned and a methodology that we think works well, but inevitably everyone's going to be coming from different perspectives and have different approaches, and some of you will be more pragmatic than others, and some of you will want a very solid business case before you do any, and others just want to kind of crack on. But I'm going to just talk through the idea of actually really having thought through this and having the time to kind of pull together a kind of clear plan of action, which I think is really important to make sure that you have the best chance of success on the channel of marketplace, because it is a channel, it's not just Amazon. And I think it's important to remember that from a diversification perspective, from a risk perspective, and also from a brand awareness perspective, because in certain markets there's other marketplaces that perhaps are more optimal for you. So you know, whilst Amazon is a big part of our business, I think it's not the only part of our business, and I think it's important to remember that you have other options as well. So particularly at the moment with all the changes going on. So in terms of setting the criteria then, the first most important thing is choosing your objectives or having clear objectives. Now, I've put a few options together based on the sort of things we usually run through, but these are the sorts of elements that businesses look for. And some of these are very tactical and some of them are much more strategic, and some of them are more fundamental to kind of what a business would expect from a new channel. But the sorts of things to consider is obviously sales and profit. They're usually the things that people like to talk about the most. I think for those that are new to marketplaces, often the first year is around investment and trying to get sales velocity. So profit isn't necessarily the most natural and easy thing to find, and perhaps it shouldn't be the main objective of the first year. I think subsequent years usually where that follows on. When you've got a bit more sales velocity. So I think it's important to maybe discern what your short-term objectives are and what your longer-term objectives are, because obviously profit will always be a longer-term objective for most businesses, or at least a prerequisite. There's other things like incremental territories. So maybe you want to diversify your international footprint into new areas. So that's something that you should look into. Brand awareness and profile. So how you can get your brand in front of more people, and what online sites are available in order to do that. Clearing discounted and outlet product is obviously another element as well that I think can work particularly well on some of the marketplaces available. Price establishment, so this might be the opposite. So this might be actually setting your price clearly on the market as a brand, so that you know you're setting an example perhaps for others. Product and market intelligence, so just understanding what else is happening on this, and perhaps getting some sales data on marketplaces you can use to inform your e-commerce plan and strategy, and also maybe even your wholesale or store kind of approach, because it's often a much easier place to start because there's already traffic there and there's already trust from the local consumers of that marketplace. So using it to gain intelligence for subsequent decisions can be really sensible. New customer acquisition, so actually obviously gaining new customers. Now obviously you're not going to get customer data in the way that you will do for your e-commerce site, but it's about reaching a new audience. Improved visibility of what's going on, whether it's resellers or competitor activity. So your brand, or if you are a brand on this call, your brand is probably already on a marketplace, whether you choose for it to be or not, and just understanding how it's presented is important, because that's still the experience a consumer's having. They're not necessarily thinking that is you or a reseller. They're not defining which one, they're just seeing your brand and your product. So making sure it's presented in the best possible light, I think, is really important. Ease and automation, so how easy is it to go live, how automated, how manual, a key element to discerning which marketplaces is right for you, because some are much more manual than others. And then the last piece around trading agility, so being able to switch things on and switch things off at reasonable pace. I know at the moment eBay are doing phenomenally well, and I think a lot of people have very quickly tried to get stock onto eBay because their stores are shut, or because their wholesale accounts are not taking any orders because they're shut. So I think having that sort of weapon in your armory can be super useful, and I think it's something that shouldn't be underestimated, particularly at the moment with the uncertainty that we're in now and perhaps ahead of us. So there's some examples, and I think what we generally would do is we'd rank these. So rank these 1 to 10 in order of importance. Anything that you want to discount, take off the list. But it's the top sort of 3 to 5 really that we're interested in. And like I mentioned, perhaps doing a short and a longer term viewpoint on this, and that can really help focus the mind on the subsequent elements we're going to run through. So I think this is the fundamental piece. The next element is around what are your global priorities? So we're now looking specifically at territorial targets, so which countries to go after. So are there strategic countries in your sites that you want to go after? Maybe it's because Germany, is a big market and you're under indexing on sales there. You might also get some e-commerce cross-border sales information, knowing that, for example, Australia is really good for your product and you want to do more in Australia. So maybe that's something that you've highlighted as an opportunity. You might have B2B sales that you're already facilitating in certain regions and you want to do more there. There might be some distributor agreements that you've got that exclude certain territories from being a priority. There's obviously product compliance, things to consider. So are your products able to sell in these countries? So for example, for fashion, there's certain labeling requirements in the US and your labels must be compliant to sell there. So are you compliant? Local VAT and sort of tax registry. So are you set up for tax registry? Is that a requirement? Is that something, if you are, that can open the doors to more operational options like putting stock on the ground. If you're not, it doesn't mean you can't do it, but it just means you've got more of a cross-border mentality, or maybe an additional cost to get you registered. The same with business entity set up. You might not need it, but if you are, obviously it's a benefit. Lingual and time zone support. So is your current setup able to sort of, from a customer service perspective, potentially, and from a kind of support perspective, able to service that territory if it's a requirement. And then the final piece, which is probably a bit more fashion specific, is around returns data. So do you have some regional returns data? Because particularly in the fashion space, returns can be significant and make a very big difference to the business case. So for example, Germany has a notoriously very high returns rate, and that can really change the business case of Germany as a massive European opportunity. So those are the sorts of things that we would generally look to consider. So moving on, we then would look into, with those two factors in mind, what marketplaces are available. And we'd look into different buckets of marketplaces. So we would say there's category specific. So I've just used a few examples here, but in the UK, Harvey Nichols is a kind of more lifestyle, aspirational, kind of luxury end business, has got a marketplace, and that is an option. If you're looking for more kind of lifestyle products that's maybe not as premium, then you have Joules as an option. And if you're into more kind of gaming and those sorts of products, you've got Game as an option for marketplaces. You've also obviously got Amazon. You've got, which is more focused on everything. We would call like an everything marketplace or a general marketplace. And then you've got more discount orientated marketplaces, which is eBay, which I guess would argue it straddles both everything and discount, because it does do a lot of full price product as well. But just as an example, this is not an exhaustive list, not supposed to be, it's more illustrative, but I think you get the idea. So what you're trying to do then is look at these and say what is possible based on the regions, what marketplaces fit within these specific areas, and are those specific areas aligned to my objectives. So you're trying to link the three things together, both what you're trying to achieve, where you're trying to achieve it, and what marketplace enable you to actually facilitate those objectives. So that's really the first port of call, because when, off the back of this, you basically created a scope, which is a list of marketplaces you then want to assess. So then the next question is how you assess them. So moving on, the first thing we would do is assess profitability. So what we're trying to do here is understand fundamentally if you're going to make money from this. And we would do this in a relatively indicative way at this stage, because we haven't selected the range or the proposition for that marketplace, and we haven't gone into the weeds of exactly what operating model we're going after. So what I would generally do is I would look at an array of operational options. So I would look into UK and look into fulfillment options from your existing DC, which could be UK. You might also have a European DC, which you might utilize as well. So by that I mean warehouse that you own or you run. There might be third-party options of other warehouses, so other 3PLs that you might want to lean on. You might have their rates, and you can work through some profitability options with that scenario in mind as well. So for example, you might have terrible EU courier rates because you don't do any business there, but you might have a warehouse option in Europe that might enable you to actually get a much better EU delivery rate, and you might want to cost that up as an option and compare it to your cross-border UK DC rate, which I think can just really focus the mind on what your options are, rather than ruling out a marketplace just because you don't have a courier rate that makes sense. And obviously, with Amazon in mind, we want to look into FBA as well. And from an FBA perspective, or fulfillment by Amazon, we're looking at a few different models that I'll come on to later, depending on strategically what you're looking to do and what you're currently perhaps already doing with Amazon. But obviously, Amazon offer multi-channel fulfillment options, so you can sell outside of Amazon as well, as long as the marketplace allows that. So those are the sorts of things we would generally look at. So you've got your list of marketplaces to focus on, and now we're looking at a few variations of operating models from from a operational perspective to do a profitability analysis on. I would also always do this analysis with a few scenarios in mind. So I'll do free delivery, free returns, and I'd also do both free delivery and returns, which is obviously optimal if you can offer that. But often profit and loss that doesn't allow that when you actually run the numbers. So I think it just depends on how margin rich you are. Most importantly, your average selling price. So looking at units per transaction, which will be a lot lower than your website. So I think that's a key thing to bear in mind. It's probably going to be between 1 to 1.5 units per transaction versus most websites are close to 3. So that's why getting your distribution rates and having a few options is really important, because if you're obviously charging £8 for delivery to go to a certain market and your average selling price is £10, surprise, surprise, you're not going to make any money doing that. Whereas if you can find a market option or a DC in market that can do that for better rates, then obviously that's going to improve your profitability. So it's all entwined, but that's the kind of thing we'd work out first, is based on the marketplace, what are my options, and can I get maybe third-party fulfillment quotes as part of this to compare against both my FBA option and my current from my own warehouse option. Okay, so that's the first bit. The second piece is then looking at your costs. So this is just an illustrative waterfall with FBA in mind. So we'd be looking at obviously taking into account Amazon's commission, to use Amazon as an example, or any other marketplace. So understand what their commission structure is. One thing to look out for on that is, is it on gross sales or is it on net sales? Pretty much all commissions are on gross sales, which means inclusive of VAT, whereas obviously you're looking at most things net, so exclusive of VAT. So make sure that your calculations are correct and you're not putting a percentage on a net figure, because that's undercooking the actual cost of the marketplace commission. Warehouse and fulfillment, so this is looking at FBA. So for this, we would be quite detailed. We'd look into average cover, so how many months would we expect products to sit in the warehouse, what the warehouse cost would be by market and by model. We would also look at relabeling costs, because FBA has often relabeling costs attached, usually 15p. We would also look at bulk shipment costs, so costs to get stock into FBA in the first place. And obviously there's a dispatch cost from FBA, which we would base on a weighting of products that you've got, so weighted by sale, so that we've got a really good overview on the potential costs involved. So that's how we would work. And by weighting, I mean, in effect, you times it by the sales mix. So you might take 3 best-selling items, which all have totally different dimensions and weights, and you times that by the sales mix to give you an average weighted by actual sales. So if one of those makes up 80% of your actual sales, then clearly you want to make sure that your number is correct when it comes to your warehouse and fulfillment costs. So that's the way that we would always look at this, to make it much more accurate than just an indicative individual product, which is not representative of how you can actually sell and therefore what your costs will be. Returns costs, so obviously on Amazon, this is looking at any dispatch and then return items coming back to FBA that you need to allocate and add logic for. Customer service, which in this example, FBA will be doing frontline customer service, so I'm not worried about that, but in other channels, that's something to consider. Marketing costs, so you might want to treat this as an overhead. It really depends. You might know what your costs are already and have that on a percentage of sale basis. So this is a variable or a fixed fee, depending on how you account for it. It usually starts off as a fixed fee and moves into a variable fee over time, but definitely something that's key to consider, particularly for Amazon, where paid search is 80% of what you land on when you click on the category. So definitely something not to underestimate. A management fee, so if you're working with an agency or anyone else, thinking about what sort of fee they might take. And then product costs, so how much the actual product costs you in the first place, and your contribution to what's left. So those are the sorts of things that we would consider on a direct cost basis, which I think are reasonably sort of complete. You might want to, if you're using a middleware option like a sort of Limworks type solution, or like a channel advisor type solution, then you might want to consider that as well, if it's on a percentage of sale basis or a cost per order basis, which obviously can be added very easily to this. But again, it just depends on if that's a fixed monthly fee or if that's a variable cost. So that's just the direct cost side of things. And then I'll move on to overheads in a moment. So the next thing we've got to do is, once you've done that analysis and you've done that across all your marketplaces, it's very easy to sort of visualize that with a kind of a stacked 100% bar chart, we find, because then you can very easily see what's profitable and not, and you can put all your marketplaces next to each other. That's kind of a nice thing to sort of to use to assess this in a more visual format. So once you've done that, you might want to rule some of these out, because it might be based on that sort of top line assumption, you're not going to make money, and there's therefore no point, if that's one of your criteria, in pursuing that anymore, because you've got no operating options that are going to make that profitable. And then that gives you a slightly smaller shortlist, and then you move on to the next phase, which is discerning which model you want to go for. So first of all, I'm sure I haven't skipped the slide. Yep, you've got management options. So are you going to do this fully outsourced? So that might be having an authorized reseller who works on a consignment and does this on your behalf. Are you going to have like a hybrid approach, which is working with an agency such as ours, and also using your internal kind of product specialism? So having someone run the marketplace expertise and the listing side of things, and having you run the trading side of things and the product and merch elements. Or you might look to do the whole thing fully in-house. So I think understanding what your options are and your preferences are important, because they're going to have an impact on the profitability of the channel and how you might run this, and also what potentially is on the table or not, because you might not have the experience to do all of the marketplaces you want to in-house. And then obviously looking at the different operational options. So this particular with FBA in mind can be a bit of a minefield. So I'm just looking at Europe here, but you've got the options are obviously your distribution center. You've got the option of having an FBA account in market, European fulfillment network, which is in effect selling cross-border through your UK FBA account. So having the FBA facilitate and your European orders, and actually you pay a premium for that per order, obviously. So it's not as good for the P&L, but it's better for stock efficiency. Multi-country inventory, the next one, which is in effect where you select pools of stock in different markets, and you have to manage that as a business and as a stock management. So it's not very efficient in terms of stock segmentation, but it is more effective when it comes to profitability, generally speaking. So, but you want velocity of sales to make that the case. And then the final one for FBA is pan-European with Europe in mind. And obviously, I think Netherlands will be added to this soon as well. So, which is when Amazon, in effect, balance load it depending on velocity of sale, and they, in effect, do the inter-country stock management, and you just do the to Amazon stock management. So it's much simpler, it's more stock efficient, and you get the great courier rate. But you need to consider things like VAT registry, because you've got to register in 7, probably soon to be 8 countries, Czech Republic and Poland inclusive, because for Germany, those countries are used to fulfill those orders, and your stock could be sitting in those warehouses at any time. So tax registry is something to consider with that. Anyway, and then integrated third parties, your other option. So having a third party that might already have stock and orders synchronized with the marketplaces in scope, and might be a good option for distribution. So those are kind of the things you've got to assess. And obviously that will help you define what your real cost base is going to be. And there'll be some commercial decisions there, because it's not all about the P&L, it's about the stock efficiency side of things, and also how many partners you want to work with, etc. And then the final piece in terms of operating model, just on a kind of simplified view, I guess, is around integration options. So marketplaces have a variety of ways of managing it. You've got a very manual process, which requires a lot of updates and can be quite easy to fall down. You've got a semi-automated, which is using flat files and sort of FTP and kind of daily update approach. You've got the leveraging existing kind of third-party option, or using FBA for stock and orders, which is sort of leaning on someone else. You've got the opportunity of doing a direct integration yourself, or you've got the opportunity of working with some sort of channel management system, which is integrated with your systems, which enables you to scale into many more marketplaces much more quickly with one integration. So those are the options you've got, and that will obviously discern to a degree your cost base, but also what marketplaces are easy for you to go after to the ease and automation point. So that's a really important thing to consider. In terms of how this relates to costs, so the first point is obviously management. So there's going to be an internal or and or an external management cost that needs to be thought about. Integration costs. So with those integration options in mind, if you're doing it with a third party, you might have no integration costs because they've dealt with that. If you're doing it maybe yourself and you've not already set up, you might have integration costs to consider. Stock segmentation. So what are the impacts of that? How much and what value of stock would need to be not in your warehouse, and what are the potential opportunity costs of that? Customer services, translation, software costs attached. Obviously, each marketplace will have a small, often monthly fee to consider, and there might be other costs from other elements in your tech stack that you've got to consider. They're usually fairly minimal, to be honest. Launch fees, potentially some marketplace sort of channel management systems and or agencies might charge additional fees to launch. Professional fees, and by this I mean legal, finance, sort of tax, etc. To launch in new countries in the main. And then the final one, perhaps design costs. So if you're doing enhanced sort of content or more brand enrichment elements, you might need to think about that as well. So that just a bit of a summary, a bit of a meze of the sorts of things you might want to consider. Now, all of these won't necessarily all be costs for you, but I think it's important that you're aware of them and that you think about them as part of your planning. So that's the overhead side of things. So in terms of how we then prioritize. So the first thing that we would do once we've got all that information and we've got a better understanding of how we might approach things is look into a sort of scoring methodology. So we would look at brand, financial, commercial, and operational. And within them, we'd be looking at a mixture of things which are based on your objectives, really. So for brand, we might be looking at competitors. So how many competitors are listing on that marketplace and how many listings are there that appear. Financial, we might be looking at pulling in the profitability analysis we've already done, and maybe any additional kind of cost elements to bear in mind by marketplace that might give it kind of plus or minus in your eyes. Commercial, so looking at the market size, we generally would look at Alexa ratings as well to see volume of traffic on that site. So if you go on the Alexa site, you can kind of see their scoring, which can be quite useful as well. So across the globe to see how much visibility the site has. And operational, so operational ease. This might include customer service. There might be there's a few independent studies that exist to kind of say by country what the most easy place is to facilitate from an e-com perspective. It might be more specific around marketplaces, which is generally how we do it. And there might be a specific area of your business that is a challenge, like maybe it's customer service. So you might want to include that, or maybe it's warehouse and logistics, whatever it might be. So that's usually it. So you'd have a few criteria, probably between 3 and 5 within each of these sections, and then basically you would kind of look to sort of discern what those are based on a few things. So first of all, what data can you provide? So e-commerce sales data you've already got, potentially, so cross-border sales. You might already have B2B sales data like we discussed earlier. You might have traffic through some of your Google Analytics data that we can use. What can you access? So what already exists from partners that you can try and get your hands on? Can you speak to marketplaces and try and get them to give you a bit more information about some of these qualifying criteria? Are there other sources you can kind of use? And then the final piece in terms of data is around what can you gather. So there might be some secondary research here required. Then it's around looking at like a mixture of points that are both objective and subjective. So you need to kind of contextualize this with what works for your business. And then we'd also look at a mixture of sources, both internal and external, because some of these will come from you and you want to make sure some of them comes from external sources. So there's a bit of a balance here. And then what we would generally recommend is some sort of very simple scoring methodology. So 1 to 5 is a very easy way of doing it. And you can create a score for 1, for 2, for 3, for 4, for 5, for each of the elements under brand, operational, commercial, etc. So that kind of gives you a very illustrative format to kind of say what makes sense for you as a business. And then moving on, you then want to weight it. So you want to say, right, this criteria is more important than this criteria. This holds more weight. So you might want to create a weighting. Usually we do 1 to 3, 1 being 1 times the score, and 3 being a 3 times the score. So something could be 3 times more important than something else. And again, that's based on your objectives. So if ease and efficiency and automation is key, then it might be that more of the operational elements are 3 and the commercial ones less so. But if profitability is key, then maybe profitability is 3, or maybe it's a blend of both. So those are the sorts of things to consider. And weighting is quite an important element to make sure it's representative of how you would make decisions. We would then suggest layering in perceived revenue, so what you would expect from each of those marketplace opportunities, which would say you should do separate to the scoring approach to give you another data set to use. And then looking at some sort of prioritized roadmap off the back of this. And then the next stage would be working out your commercial proposition. So this is very much a whistle stop, but those are the sorts of things that I would recommend you consider, and a potential approach you may want to use bits of for yourself. So just to recap, the first thing is about define. So defining, looking at your objectives, your global priorities, and obviously scoping it by marketplace. Assess, so look at what model options you've got available to you, and looking to get to some form of contribution by marketplace where you can slightly refine what you've already put into scope and maybe rule some of them out at that stage. Select, so look at obviously selecting the right model for your business, which includes fulfillment, technology, and also internal or external resource, or a mix of both often. And then the final piece is around prioritization. So create a scorecard that kind of works based on what you think is important, review revenue projections, and then make a considered roadmap with those things in mind, because hopefully you've got a very overarching view at that stage. So that's me. I think I might be a couple of minutes over, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, you're good. Very good. Yeah, you're on time there.
Good.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that's all right.
That was a really good presentation, and you've lived up to the rich insights, so that's really, really helpful. We do have a couple of questions, a few questions coming through. So if I can just shoot those over, and we could maybe look at those. We've got a question from Paul. Paul asks, how long should this process take typically?
Good question, Paul. So generally speaking, it really depends on how focused the time is you've got for this. So I would say 1 to 2 months, depending on how much data you can get. I think you can do it in a couple of weeks at a real sprint, but the reality is there's always delays in getting information, and often internal delays can be just as much as external. I think if you're a lot more pragmatic, you're maybe a one-man band and you've got real focus and energy to do this quickly, I think a couple of weeks is possible, definitely. But I would say for bigger companies, the longer it takes from experience. So yeah, I'd say 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on how many other stakeholders are involved and how many other layers of decision making there are, I think is realistic. So we generally say 1 to 2 months.
Great. Another question from Hannah. What management options is best suited to a business with limited marketplace experience? Because you've covered some of that in your talk, that it's helpful to have some of that experience, but when you don't, what should you do? So what management options are suitable for that sort of business?
I think hybrid works really well because it gives you a mix of both marketplace expertise, but also you as a business having trading and brand and sort of hopefully stock management expertise. So I think those two things working in tandem can be great. I think for those that want to not touch this and don't want to be as involved, then perhaps look at authorized reseller options. The only challenge with that is around I guess long-term strategy and how invested and involved you want to be as a brand. Because if this is strategically important, then maybe it's something you don't want to not know anything about. And I use the example of Toys R Us, right, with Amazon, where they gave the keys to Amazon of their e-commerce business, and now look at them. So I think there's short-term and there's long-term things to consider. So I would definitely suggest if this is an important channel and it is now over 50% of e-commerce and it is looking to be 65% of e-commerce in the next 2 years, I would argue it is an important channel, and you as a brand have a duty of care to your brand to know more about it. So I think you need some sort of ownership and involvement. So I would always opt for hybrid or internal.
Great, thank you. And then another question from Harshal. I've heard about B2B platforms. What is the difference, and how do I know that it suits my business?
Ooh, okay. Well, it depends on what you mean by B2B platforms, because there's obviously platforms within B2C platforms that are B2B, like Amazon Business, for example. So, I mean, it would be good to understand a little bit more about that question, if that was possible. The challenge with marketplaces generally are there's a lot of different different businesses that class themselves as marketplaces that aren't marketplaces. But there are increasingly B2B marketplaces that are actually coming into play. So this is becoming a new area of opportunity. Whether or not what you're looking at is a marketplace or whether or not it's a wholesale model for e-commerce, I'm not sure. So I think it would be good to understand that better if possible.
Okay. We've got another question. What is often the usual place for a brand or a reseller to start?
The usual place to start. I mean, obviously Amazon, right? Amazon is a behemoth. It's massive, and particularly when you're a UK brand, because we all know how much we all shop on Amazon and how much money we spend, at least at the moment, in our household, it seems. So, I mean, it's over a third of all e-commerce in the UK. So if you're a UK business, probably going to consider that one first. I think eBay's often the sort of next port of call for businesses when they're reviewing this, because it's significant. It can work very well for certain categories, and it's often a bit undervalued. I personally believe. I think it can work really well. So I would say those are the two that usually are looked at first, kind of in that order in the main, and then it's often Europe, US, Australia. Those are usually the order of things for most businesses that we work with, at least. Obviously, Asia is one that people are really interested in terms of territorially, but often there's a lot more complexity attached and a lot more things to work through. So that's often not where people would start. Cracking it sort of domestically or in your local markets is usually the first protocol. And to test it, Amazon's usually where people would start, just because there's so much sales velocity and there's an element of understanding to it, because most people are consumers who are making those decisions.
Paul's back with another question for you, Rich. How much should I budget for this process?
How much should you budget? Well, it depends on if you do it yourself or not. So there's a few options in terms of that, because this doesn't need to cost you anything over and above resource and a lot of hard work. So I think it depends on what size of business you are, and how many sort of man hours, I guess, it's going to take. If you're going to externally source it, I think it again is going to vary, because if you get a freelancer involved or someone who's got some experience, it's going to perhaps cost you less than getting an agency with a proper sort of approach to this lined up. So it's impossible to say. Again, it depends on the size of the scope. So we're looking at all markets, or we're looking at a selective amount of markets. But what I would say, if Paul wants to ask me separately and he's got something in mind, I'm happy to kind of pull together some pricing for him.
Great, because we've also got another question from Catherine, and she's asking what are the typical costs to engage Richard. So perhaps you'd like to...
Is that personally or professionally?
So maybe, yeah, go ahead. Any suggestions of how I can contact you?
Yeah, so at the end of this, I think there's a sales@richinsight.co.uk email address, or richard@richinsight.co.uk. Both of them will find my inbox in some way. So feel free to sort of email at the back of this, and happy to talk through and cost up options based on your businesses.
Alexia's got two questions, and I'm just going to join them up. She's saying, what about Shopify? And her second question is, or Etsy as a platform?
Interesting, yeah, because Shopify is recently a really interesting one to watch with its announcements around marketplaces and what it's looking to do. I think we're watching that eagerly to see how that's going to present itself. So that's one that I haven't got lots of direct experience on as it stands, because it's obviously kind of relatively, well, extremely new. But I think it's one to consider. A lot of our brands are on the Shopify platform anyway, and I'm sure many of you on this call are. So I think it's a really interesting one to be aware of, and that could be an easy one to consider. Etsy, I mean, I was just reading about it last night, actually. I mean, they doubled their sales, I think, over the last couple of months, and they're doing phenomenally well. I think Etsy, generally speaking, is more focused on people who are handcrafted goods. So if that's the area you're in, then brilliant. But again, it's hard to kind of offer advice without knowing more about your business. I think Etsy is a great platform, and the sales can be significant, particularly at the moment on it. But it's a question of how aligned it is to you as a business. I think for smaller businesses, it can work very well. And I've got, personally speaking, I've got some friends on Etsy who are doing really well and keep selling out of little rainbow things they're making for the crisis we're in. So I think there's definitely some opportunities, but it is generally seen as more of a handcrafted niche marketplace. So you can get some scale from it, but you need a very specific product catalog in order to do that, I would say.
We've got some happy webinars. So Catherine has said that it's absolutely professionally that she'd like to reach out. So that's good to know. And
Great.
Alexa says, thanks for answering a question. That's what she's really appreciative. But she said, my business is food and deli stuff. So does that change your answer slightly?
Interesting. Was this one about B2B?
No, this is actually the one around Etsy and Shopify.
Okay. Again, you need to understand what the product type is. I think, I mean, I don't necessarily think food and Etsy is the most obvious link from how I see the marketplace as it stands. I mean, I know Amazon are doing phenomenally well in that category. We've got a lot of inquiries in that particular vertical and other marketplaces. But I don't know. I can't really comment with that in mind. But I do know that there's at least one B2B marketplace opening up in the food space that I think could be really interesting. So if you'd like to contact me after, happy to share that. It's not yet launched, but I think it will be this year. So that could be quite a good one for you.
That's brilliant. And just to mention to our listeners that last week we had a how-to with Frugo, and they took us through their platform using one of their brands to talk us through how to trade on their platform and cross-border. So if you're interested, that's also on our website at the moment. So I think we've run out of time and run out of questions too. So we just want to thank everybody for joining us and sharing all their questions. And a big thank you to Rich. That was a great session, Rich. I've learned a few more things today too. So I'm hoping other people can take these great tips and this practical advice, but please do reach out to Rich. He's on the usual social media channels. He'll be available on our website. We'll be sending out an email along with a recording. So there'll be lots of opportunities to try and reach out to Rich. But if you have anything that you've done and you've implemented and you can feed back to us, we'd be really happy to put those in our newsletters and talk to you about it. So finally, if we have any more webinars in the next, we have a few more webinars coming up in the next few weeks. And I think there is a page to announce that. And next week we have one with View My Website, and they help a lot of our smaller businesses set up on Amazon. So do come along to that. So with that, Rich, thank you very much for your time. And I hope you have a good day. And please do reach out.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Cheers.
Bye-bye.